What's up guys, my name is Josh and today we're going to be talking about a comparison between the Hifiman Arya, the Ananda, and the new Edition XX. So right off the bat I want to make you aware of a couple different things. One, this is a little bit of an unfair comparison. You're talking about a $600 headphone versus an $800 headphone versus a $1,600 headphone. I kind of want to talk about that progression and the price change near the conclusion. All right, so before we get started into sound, let's go ahead and talk about the build. The headbands are all different on all of these. My favorite is actually the Edition XX because it's the lowest profile. It's kind of the most sturdy and strong feeling of the three, and it does swivel enough for, you know, meaningful head adjustments, whereas the Ananda doesn't swivel at all, and the Arya does swivel, but this headband is just more solid feeling, and it actually is the most comfortable on my particular head, but your results are probably going to vary. All three have a very similar pad structure, kind of this hybrid pad design where it's kind of a, you know, woven cloth material on the actual part that touches your head, a perforated leather on the inside or simulated leather, and then a simulated leather on the outside. All three pads are the same. Now for me, I am going to recommend an amplifier for all three. They are all revealing enough, the Arya being the most revealing of them, to benefit from an amplifier, and they all need a fair bit of juice to get decently loud. Now outside the headband, they're all pretty much similar. You know, the Arya I think looks the best just because of the black on black. I personally think the silver on black seems just a little bit cheap looking to me, especially since all three have a plastic design, and it kind of looks like that, especially in person. All right, so sound. Now the delivery of these three headphones, they're all fairly different, but the Ananda and the Arya are actually somewhat similar in their delivery, but there's other differences. We'll talk about that as time goes on here. But the biggest difference of all three is actually the Edition XX. It's kind of closer. Now, when I compared the Edition XX to the LCD2C, I said it was a spacious sound, and all three of these do sound spacious, but this of the three is the most intimate. It's the most packed in. And, you know, for those of you who really like a really wide open sound signature to where you really want that three-dimensional sound, that really holographic soundstage, this has the least of that. When I'm saying that, I want to make a distinction here. It's not like HD 600 or 650 levels of intimacy. It's not like that at all. As a headphone, separated from these, just as this headphone in its own bottle, it's a fairly spacious sound, just comparatively it's an intimate headphone. Whereas on the other side, that kind of holographic soundstage to where you feel like you're kind of placed in a listening environment and not just listening to a pair of headphones, the Ananda and the Arya both do that very, very well. But there are a couple other key differences here because of that delivery system. So bass response is it's not really like a vast amount more than the Ananda or the Arya. But what it is more present. It's just, you know, it's a more intimate bass response. It's more in your face, it's more shoved towards you, and you definitely get that feeling. It feels a lot more kind of impactful than the other two do. Not by like I don't want to make it out to seem like it's a massive margin of difference, but it is a noticeable difference where you're like, okay, the bass is definitely more on this. Now, since we're already talking about bass, I guess we'll get this out of the way. So the bass response difference here, besides that, you know, that intimate delivery, that impactful delivery, I actually think that the bass is best done on the Arya. And the reason why is because on the Arya, it almost feels separated from the music, right? It doesn't feel like it is, you know, really in your face. It feels like, you know, low notes that are created to be low notes, like on a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, those are just amazing, and they're coming from all around you. They're surrounding, they're wrapping, but they're not claustrophobic in their delivery, and they're not super impactful in their delivery either. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no impact in the bass. There certainly is, but you don't really get this kind of slammy feeling like you can with other planar headphones. And that somewhat slammy feeling is kind of what the Edition XX gives you, although not, you know, nearly as much as the headphone that I compared against earlier, the 2C. That is definitely like a harder, more immediate, you know, kind of, it's just a, you know, a wall of sound basically for the bass response. This is more like just an all-encompassing globe. Now the Ananda comparatively, and I keep calling it Ananda, whatever, you know what I mean. The Ananda comparatively, it kind of has the same feel, but it's drier in the bass response. It doesn't have as much guts to it. It doesn't have as much low down. And this headphone overall has kind of a more mid-range and top-end focus. And there's actually some really strong benefits to the Ananda over the Ananda. Damn, there's really strong benefits to the Ananda over some of the other options here. But as an overall category, I would say if you really like that more in-your-face version of sound in general, the Edition XX is probably going to be the superior option here for you. If you're into the more traditionally audiophile things like sound staging and dynamics and the presentation of things, I think that the Ananda and the Arya tend to separate themselves a little bit better and are definitely where you're going to want to put your money. Okay, so mid-range. Now, mid-range is fairly interesting because I feel like they're all somewhat similar, especially in tonality, but where the Edition XX may have a little bit more, intimate, closer vocals. So the vocals are good in that intimacy setting. Where the other two headphones, the Ananda and the Arya, separate themselves, though, is really, well, the separation of it. The Edition XX tends to get a little bit lost, especially with a lot of, really present music, especially when the background music is brought up in volume comparatively to the singer. I think the song that I really noticed at first was Sam Smith's Like I Can. And that song has like really loud background music and the vocalist just gets kind of blurred out with it. And it seems like that gap between the vocalist and the background music just gets crunched into the same level of kind of two-dimensional, broad sound. Whereas the Ananda and the Aryas tend to separate themselves a little bit better. Well, actually quite a bit better, especially the Arya, but $1,600. But we'll talk about that in a sec. Now, to the benefit of both the Ananda and the Arya, what they are able to do is kind of give you that embodiment of the singer's kind of involvement in the listening environment. So you can really feel like the singer is literally a person just standing in an environment where you have the background music. It's very easy to visualize that sound. And for me, as a person who likes vocals, sometimes I like the more intimate nature of something like an HD6XX or the intimate nature of an LCD2C. But other times, especially when I really want to if I want to hear everything, I really want that kind of visualizable separation that the Ananda and the Arya give you. So treble response, and this is really where the Ananda kind of takes over and steps up a little bit because it's the most treble, I wouldn't say intense. Like certain people, yeah, of course they're gonna find it a little bit too bright. I find this to be the most shiny of the treble response of the three. Now, I'm specifically saying shiny. I'm not saying the best treble. I think the Arya definitely has the best treble here in terms of the way it's able to deliver with a smooth characteristic, yet in a way that's detailed beyond the capability of both of these by a mile. But because of the kind of shiny, sweeter characteristic of the Ananda, this actually and the spaciousness nature of it, this makes for great orchestral music, especially when you're talking about horns or strings. So if you're somebody who listens to symphonies and you want all the little the spacious characteristics of a symphony, but you don't want something like HD800s, which are going to be kind of piercing in some categories, this is actually a really, really good option for that. I personally loved the orchestral soundtracks on this. Even in certain cases more than the Arya, and in almost every case more than the Edition XX for that specific genre and style of music. Now, treble response in the Edition XX is certainly not bad. I wouldn't call it class leading though. I would say that for the $600-ish price category, the HD660s and the DT1990s both do treble response better than this does, but it's certainly not bad. It's just not the top of the heap at its price category. And it does have a fair amount of resolution there, but not a substantial amount, not a class-leading amount at all. But what does have a class-leading amount of detail in the treble response and resolution in the treble response is the Arya. And this is really the separating factor for the treble. Of all three of these headphones, this does treble the best for my preferences. And the reason why is because it's a soft delivery in terms of the harshness of it. Like, it doesn't really seem to have a lot of treble harshness, even in things that are incredibly crisp or clear, like the chimes in the Daft Punk Random Access Memory album that I bring that up a lot, but it's good to have a reoccurring reference, I think. Those are more, sharp and not painfully sharp, but just they're more attentive sounding on the Ananda, but they're so much more pleasing on the Arya. And the reason why is because even though it's not as present in that region as the Ananda is, the underlying detail, the underlying information there is just so much more. And you know, this really leads us into the imaging and the soundstage category in a sec, but I want to focus on this for just a minute. But a little bit of a spoiler, it's mainly just because of how easily you can place it in the room and how easily you can place it in the mix and how well separated and almost disconnected it feels. For me, the Arya is kind of like listening to almost like 3 different pairs of headphones, right? You've got a bass headphone that all it does is producing bass, and it's producing bass in this all-encompassing way. You've got this mid-range that is, you know, only the singer's voice, and that's it, right? Or only the guitar, or only this, or only that. And then you have the high notes, which are separated even more, and you know, the background instruments and the sound staging is handled by that third headphone, so to speak. And it's that separation is literally that clear to me, where it's almost like it's being handled by different things. It's such a unique experience. And the Ananda does a pretty good job of kind of trying to emulate that in a way. It does kind of in certain songs, especially really well recorded songs, like some of Diana Krall's work. They're just like, this thing does really a spectacular job for somewhat sounding like that. It just doesn't have that extra level of refinement. And this is, in my opinion, the most notable in the treble response in how it approaches you. You know, the treble is more attentive on here, like I said, but it just doesn't have the kind of clear cut characteristic of the Arya. Okay, so imaging and soundstage, and this is going to be a big toss-up of preference. I will say for technical purposes, the XX is the most intimate, like I said. This is kind of in the middle in terms of intimacy and in terms of width. And then the Arya is going to be the widest, but it also has this weird characteristic, and the only other headphone that I can really compare it to are some of the electrostats, where it's almost like the vocalist is intimate, but like not in a normal way. The vocalist is, you know, it's that classic example of like, there's vocals that are happening in front of you, and then there's vocalists where you kind of are the microphone, right? And that's what the Edition XX sort of feels like. It feels like you are, you know, you are in the microphone, and then the Ananda and the Arya sounds like, you know, it's kind of happening in a sense on a stage in front of you. So the XX is somewhat separated, and the Arya and the Ananda sound similar. It's just, you know, not to be overly harsh or overly critical, because it is a very good headphone and it is half the cost literally, but it almost feels like the Ananda is kind of like a cheap knockoff version of that soundstage, of that separation, of that dynamics. And I think that leads us into the conclusion a little bit, is that's basically how it goes. Yeah, it goes with the price, in my opinion. It's like you got $600 for the Edition XX. That's a good price. I think it's a fair headphone at that price point. You've got a little bit better, but somewhat picky in terms of what you would want to listen to on it, but very good at what it does do well, which is going to be the Ananda. And then you have like the beast, right? The headphone that I called the best headphone I've reviewed so far, and that still holds true today. There's a review of it down below, but you have the Arya at $1,600. And this is where the discussion of value comes up. And you know, it's kind of really similar to a lot of the conclusions that I've come to before, and probably will be the similar conclusion that I come to for headphones in the future. You know, if you're going for value here, I think it's really between the Ananda and the Edition XX, and just based off of your preference. But if you want to pay double, like literally you could buy both of these headphones and still have $200 left over, you could get the Arya. And the Arya is just, you know, it's sound refined. It makes these other two look like amateurs. And, you know, I don't mean that to be super harsh or overly critical of it, but that's really what it is here. Now, when it comes to the discussion of whether that's worth double the money, from a pure value perspective, no, it definitely isn't. It is. But if you want the best performer you can get of these three, that is going to be the king. King of value, but all three of these headphones are amazing options. You'll find links to everything that I talked about in the description down below. Can you go wrong with any of these? In my opinion, no, not really. They're all really great. You just really want to know what they do and which ones you're going to appreciate more depending on what you like. Again, links are down below. Consider supporting me on Patreon. It does take a long time to put these videos together and do all the B-roll for it. So I appreciate you patrons. You guys kick ass. And I do have a special project going on over there. So if you want early access to that project, there's a link down below. All right. Thanks very much for watching. I appreciate your time. My name's Josh, signing off.